This is an IBM PS1 Essential from 1993. When it hit retailers all those years ago, it ranked among the least expensive computers in IBM's lineup. It shipped with an Intel 486 clocked at 25 MHz, 2 MB of RAM, and a 129 GB hard disk, and even had a modem. If you're familiar with PC specifications from the time, you'll know that it was nothing fancy. In fact, it's arguably this PC in particular that proved IBM's time as a leader in the PC market was at an end. But that's kind of why I like this computer. Humble PCs like this brought MS-DOS and Windows to tens of millions of new households through the early 1990s, and with them, of course, came computer games. So let's dig into the history of this essential early 1990s PC and see what it can do.
At last, a computer for the whole family, with popular options already included. The IBM PS1, a new kind of computer, the kind you've been waiting for all along.
When you hear the name IBM, even today, a few words probably come to mind. Words like work, enterprise, productivity, business, spreadsheets. And in the early 1990s, that was precisely IBM's problem. Home PCs were becoming more capable, which meant they were beginning to eat into the low end of the business market that IBM relied on. The problem was not a secret. An editorial in the October 1990 issue of Compute magazine, the same issue, it's no coincidence, that reviewed the first IBM PS1 Essential, boldly proclaimed that a, quote, new wave of computer buyers are poised to enter the market. The new wave wanted to run productivity software, sure, but also newfangled entertainment like online services, educational programs, and yes, computer games. The IBM PS1 Essential was Big Blue's play at this market, and it was a big deal. With hindsight, we all know IBM would lose this battle, of course. The consumer PC market would eventually move on, and IBM would sell the division to Lenovo. But in the 1990s, when the first PS1 Essential was released, IBM was still the biggest player in the PC market. The problem for IBM wasn't that they could not sell computers at all, but rather that their market share was being eaten into by new competitors like Compaq and HP. They were selling cheap home PCs by the millions. And IBM, which, let's be honest, always had kind of an egotistical take on its own brand, was reluctant to lower its prices to compete. But eventually the company had to start giving in to retain market share. The IBM PS1 Essential was the response. It was more affordable, though still rather expensive for the hardware, with an MSRP of $1,999. Adjusted for inflation, that would put it at about $4,800 today. It was even sold at retailers like Sears. Finally, any Joe Blow could buy an IBM computer in the same store where they bought their pants. And if you remember doing that, or your parents doing that back in the day, leave a comment, because personally I never had the experience. By the time my family was buying computers, Best Buy and Circuit City had pretty well taken over the market, and I can't recall ever seeing a computer for sale in a department store. Anyway, there's several great videos on YouTube about the original PS1 Essential. The video you're seeing now is from Adrian's Digital Basement, and I'll leave a link in the description. They all underscore its rather weird design. The PS1 that shipped in 1990 ran MS-DOS, but the power supply was for some reason bundled into the monitor, meaning it couldn't be swapped out. And while it supported upgrades for RAM, hard drive, and additions like a sound card, all of this used a proprietary interface designed by IBM. The original was also, truth be told, rather slow, shipping with a 286 at 10 MHz, when some competitors at the time were already moving to the Intel 386 instead. None of this seemed to be a problem for media outlets covering the PS1, as they largely praised the machine as a go-to pick for PC-curious consumers. But shoppers were more skeptical and reluctant to buy a PC with such limited support for industry-standard hardware, and IBM's share of the PC market continued to dip. Clearly, something had to change.
Unfortunately, imitations often fall short of the original, so why settle for an imitation? Get any IBM computer this week at Best Buy and get 0% for 1 year, like this 486SX with 129 meg hard drive, 4 megs memory, modem, dual floppies, VGA monitor, and all this software for just $15.98.
Which brings us to the IBM PS1 Essential from 1993. I picked up this machine at a yard sale last year for $50. It is model number 2133-W45 and appears to be from late 1993. The owner actually had two of them, both of which were in great shape and came with the original monitor and mouse. The keyboard was long gone, though. The sellers said they had once worked in software design and testing, but had barely touched the computers in well over a decade, maybe even two. Based on the look of the machines, I believe it, because while I did brush off a bit of dust here and there, this machine was otherwise in great condition. I left the other one to find another owner, by the way. Spread out the love a little bit, you know. It was a similar story inside the PC as well, but it's hardly even dusty. When it came time to turn it on though, I ran into one small problem and one modest problem. The timekeeping battery had died unsurprisingly, but thankfully this model of IBM PS1 Essential uses a standard battery that's easily replaced. Once I had fixed that, however, the machine would not boot into DOS or detect a hard drive, which on closer inspection I discovered was dead and seemed to be missing a capacitor or two. As much as I enjoy the classic sound of a mechanical disk, I did want to use this computer fairly frequently and wanted it to be reliable, so I swapped in an IDE to SD card adapter. I was also able to find the original recovery disks on the Internet Archive. After about an hour of installation, I was in business. The machine was working like it was new out of the box. Now, at a glance, this IBM PS1 looks a lot like the earlier models. It is similar in color, in design, and of course has Big Blue's understated but iconic branding. On a closer inspection, you will notice the monitor is no longer integrated, but the general shape and look of the PC is still pretty close to the original PS1 Essential. But this PC was IBM's admission that it was no longer in charge of the PC market, and taking the enclosure off shows why, because once we remove the top of the case, which slides off smoothly without any tools, we get to the guts of the computer, and well, it's basically a standard MS-DOS computer that could have come from almost any manufacturer. As I mentioned earlier, this model has an Intel 486 clocked at 25 MHz. It also had space for Intel's Math coprocessor, an option that seems a bit weird in retrospect, but was not uncommon at the time. The RAM, hard drive, floppy disk drives, both the 3.5-inch and 5.25-inch, and the bundled modem all conform to industry standards of the time, and they are powered by a normal power supply that's located in the desktop enclosure exactly where you would expect to find it. And turning our attention to the rear of the machine, we can see the most obvious and critical sign of IBM's surrender: a trio of ISA slots on a riser card. While the original PS1 only supported a handful of proprietary expansion cards from IBM, later models slowly added some ISA compatibility, and the 1993 IBM PS1 Essential did a complete 180 with a trio of standard ISA slots that worked exactly like you would expect from any competing PC. All of this was bad news for IBM. The company had always thought of itself as something special, a leader in the field, a giant whose brand recognition and tightly integrated design gave users an experience they could not find anywhere else. The 1993 IBM PS1 Essential was an admission that was no longer true. Unlike the very first PS1, there's really nothing specific about this computer's hardware that would give it an edge over the competition. And aside from a little bit of IBM branding in Windows 3.1, it does very little to promote the IBM brand. But for consumers and for gamers, a standardized PS1 Essential was good news. This 1993 model, unlike the original, could support industry standard sound cards, which was very important for any gamer at the time. I upgraded this PS1 with an ES audio drive sound card, and it works great. Don't get me wrong though, I'm not trying to be too down on this IBM PS1 Essential, because even though it was a herald of IBM's doom in the consumer market, it's actually a really nice retro PC. I really like the true desktop design. I like the chunky power button that has a nice mechanical click. I like how it's easy to open the case by just sliding off the top. I like the overall look and feel. It is bland and it is beige, but it also feels like it was built by engineers who cared about the user experience. But was it really any good at games? Well, let's find out by trying a few. But before we do that, let's hear a word from our sponsor. And today's sponsor is me, or more specifically, my book on EverQuest, which is published by Boss Fight Books. EverQuest was an extremely influential game in online gaming culture. For example, EverQuest is one of the first games where players bought and sell items for real money, and it is also one of the first online games to get an emulated server scene, which continues to be very important to this day. So if you have an interest in online games, I think you might enjoy this book, and I will leave a link to it in the description. Now, with that said, let's get back to the video about the PS1 Essential. So we have to start, of course, with Doom. It was released a few months after the first PS1 Essential would have hit store shelves, and everyone knows you can run it on a potato, so I'm sure it will, oh, okay. I don't have enough memory. Well, as it turns out, memory really is the biggest limitation on the basic PS1 Essential that shipped in 1993. Not all games towards the end of 93 required more than 2 megabytes of memory, but some notable titles including Doom and SimCity 2000 did. Of course, a memory upgrade is possible, but unfortunately for me, this PS1 Essential has given me fits when I've tried to swap into RAM. I don't know if it's due to the memory sticks themselves, or if I'm missing something about what kind of RAM I am supposed to use, but I've been unable to get anything except for the 2MB stick that came with the computer to work in it so far. But that's okay, because even if it won't run Doom, there are plenty of games it can run, like, for example, Doom 2. Honestly, I was kind of blown away by the graphics and sound of some games I could load on this PC. And Doom 2 is a great example because it looks and plays very nicely on this CRT monitor, despite, and actually perhaps because of its small size. Doom 2 is commonly recognized as the first modern real-time strategy game, but it is very basic compared to titles that came out just a few years later, and obviously designed for lower display resolution. So if you're going to play it today, I feel like playing it on a small CRT like this is really the way to go. Now, as you might expect, games that were a year or two older run just fine on this PC. Lemmings was released in February of 1991, and while the dozens of on-screen characters it has might suggest some technical complexity, it requires nothing more than a 386 with 512 kilobytes of memory, so the PS1 Essential handles it no problem. Also, Lemmings is still awesome, and I think I might do a video on it in the near future, so if you don't want to miss that, be sure to subscribe. Now, older 3D titles are also fine, because this is the era prior to 3D accelerators as we know them today. PC titles were generally handling them on the CPU, and although a 25MHz 486SX was not state-of-the-art in 1993, it was still a solid choice, and of all the games that I both actually tested and even considered for testing, the 25MHz processor at least met the minimum system requirements for all of them. Still, to test out 3D, I decided to load up Bill Elliott's NASCAR Challenge. Have you heard of this one? It was released in March of 1991, and I chose it mostly because I have the game physically on hand, and also because I played it back when I was a kid. That's why I ended up buying it when I saw it at a retro game store for like $10. It is a simulation racing game where you drive around in circles, as you do in NASCAR, and actually finishing a full simulated race is something I've never managed to do, because this game is tough as nails, but there's something about the graphics and sound of this particular title that strikes a chord with me. When I was a kid, I would just load up this game and repeatedly crash over and over again, and I thought it was amazing. Oh, and strangely, I did get Doom working. It does launch through the Windows 3.1 shell. But as you can see, the results are not great. It has all the signs of being due to the memory because the game can very rarely run smoothly in small rooms, but it's otherwise a slideshow. So obviously, this PS1 Essential would not have been the best choice for playing games in 1993. But I also think it would not have been a bad choice either. It's worth remembering this was kind of a different era of media, and the fact a PC couldn't play the very latest and greatest titles was often not such a big deal because unless you were a super hardcore gamer who bought PC gaming magazines the moment they came out, it could be months or even years before you'd even hear about the hottest new titles. I don't know about you, but I don't think I even heard about Doom until 1995. And by then, of course, pretty much any PC you'd find new on store shelves could run it. Humble machines like this were modest when they hit store shelves, and they did quickly go obsolete. In particular, this does not have a CD-ROM drive, and by 1994 you'd be starting to see games that require that. But they still introduced millions of people to PC gaming. So that is it for the PS1 Essential. This is now my main computer for playing games from the late 80s and early 90s, and I quite enjoy it. I have a few upgrades in mind. For example, I'd like to get a floppy drive emulator to more easily put games onto the computer, as currently I am either installing them through floppy disks, which oftentimes don't work, or I am putting them on the SD card, which means I have to open the computer every time I want to add a game. Now, computers like this were considered, no doubt, a bit bland at the time even they were released, but personally, I like the squared-off button-down design of this old IBM. I guess I've always liked basic but well-engineered technology, and this certainly fits the bill. So that's going to be it for me for now. If you liked the video, make sure you hit the thumbs up, and if you want to see more like it, make sure to subscribe to Computer Gaming Yesterday, and I will see you next time.